Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm your host, Derek. With me, I have Evan. Hello.
Hey, sir.
Today, we are going to dive right in, I think, on Genesis 1:4 as we
Mhm.
as we plug along here. Eventually, we'll actually do more than one verse in an episode, but not for the first day, I suppose. Okay, so this is where, and God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So, in reading some various commentaries and such on this, I saw a few places that suggested that the Hebrew syntax here actually better matches God saying, God saw the light, comma, that it was good,
Mm,
rather than God saw that the light was good.
yeah, that's an awkward sentence in English. That makes sense why they would translate it differently, just
But
for
it
for
is,
regular understanding.
but it's interesting that that's the opposite of the way it is in the next five instances. And then the dynamic returns in the seventh.
Well, oh, yeah, absolutely. So it might bear some significance. It's just it is awkward syntax for an English reader.
Yes,
So
yes.
you
I
would
think
you would
it's
read that and you would think, well, this sounds who translated this? This is terrible, you know.
it
But it
does.
might have meaning.
I think it's interesting, right? Because it does a couple of things. It has the appearance, at least this version, of God like pausing to survey his creation.
Mm-hmm.
Um and that implies, I think, going to the idea of God out of time, right? By putting it at the first and at the seventh, when we put that all together, it sort of has a pause of God surveying all of his creative work at once and saying it's good, right? So if you have God at the beginning saying God saw the light that it was good, and then at the end God saying God saw it that it was good, you have these bookends where it's like God is surveying all of his creation and
Mm-hmm.
seeing that the whole thing is good, not just the individual component, right? Um, so thinking of light as order, basically God looking at his plan for the order of the universe, seeing that it's good, and then at the end God seeing that plan now in place and seeing that it's good, right? uh that's
Yeah.
the way I see it. It's kind of like this: here's my plan, here's reviewing how the plan was enacted.
Well, I think even it's testing, legitimately, like testing the waters. What would we implied that the creation of the light is God's first engagement with
Right,
initial creation. It's the first mixing with
right.
creation. And so observing whether that is good or not is very crucial. So
Yeah.
that pause of saying, let me look at the results of this first engagement that I
Mm-hmm.
chose to do, and then recognizing that it's good means that for the continuation of the work, saying days 2 through 6, he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't stop to look again,
Yeah,
and
I
now assumes that the engagement is good.
well, in a way, yeah, he just confirms it immediately, kind of, not this pause component, right? But that does bring up, I think, the question here we want to ask, which is, why would God even need to confirm that it's good, right? The idea of I mean, God, if he's God, he knows it's good. Like, why this pause? Why this confirmation? Why even say this, right? Um, and it's interesting to think about it in terms of how we think of God, right? Um, we have a tendency, obviously, because it's the only thing we can do, to oversimplify our description of an entity and a force that is by nature beyond our comprehension, right? We can never understand God, so we have this way of oversimplifying him. um, but we talk about the idea of God is himself good, right? And he only does that which is good. And I personally accept that to be true, right? That works. So the fact that God would need to confirm whether his attempt to bring order to chaos was in fact good, I think it says a few different things, particularly about the nature of bringing order to chaos. And this is I mean, it's written to us, so God described it this way for our sake. All right. So what we can understand is that there are many ways in which one can attempt to bring order to chaos.
Yeah.
And there are many that are good in their nature, but may fail to actually bring that order. So for instance, good intentions, but with the wrong plan, right? This is something we're familiar with. As humans, there are things we do all the time where we may have had the right intentions, but it worked out very poorly because of our incapacity or our poor planning or our unforeseen circumstances, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Where you act with the right intentions. Yeah, you act with the right intentions, but it fails to bring the order that it was meant to bring. So in a way, what God is doing here is he's confirming for our sake that this is the right plan for bringing chaos into order. It is the good, right? As though there was a possibility of it not doing that. And God would have never chosen that possibility, obviously, because he's God and is good himself and only does that which is good. However, a verse like this, I think, is meant to reassure us as readers that God has seen the goodness in his plan and that we may trust that path. And that, let me just say,
so it's a form of signaling.
Yeah, it's a message to us. I mean, the whole Bible's a message to us, obviously. But the reason it's phrased this way is a message to us specifically, because that's what we would do, right? We aren't capable of knowing everything all at once. So if we were enacting a plan, it would make good sense. It would be prudent for us to enact a part of it, pause and say, is this going where we want it to? Is this the right plan? And then move forward, right? And so that by God portraying that here, it's him saying, I've seen my plan. It is a good one. It is the right one. It is the way to bring order out of chaos, right? And this idea works especially good if we think of it as the beginning and the end, right? As him phrasing it that way with the start and as the bookend, because it's those two together that encapsulate all of it. And he sees his plan is good, and then he sees all that he created is good. And so it's a way of God reassuring us that his plan is the right one to bring order to all creation.
Yeah. It's interesting that it's good that comes in after light, and it doesn't come in after the initial creating of the heavens and the earth.
Yes.
Which if we're assuming that that's chronological too, that this isn't the book title, the book heading, like we talked about before, but assuming that it is chronological, that God creates the heavens and the earth, and then there's this anticipatory period, and then God says, let there be light, and then there's the observation of the light, or the actual creation of the light, and then there's the observation of the light, and then the determination that it's good. It's the interacting with it that's perceived as good.
Well, see, that I was going to say that's the key there is conceptually it makes sense, because what God is saying when he creates the heaven and earth and doesn't say that is that, it at least is, we don't have to say that anything up to that point is necessarily bad, as we talked about previously. It's that it is not good. It's like it's not good or not yet good or whatever, right? It's not that thing which God is describing with goodness. So
goodness is active.
Well, it's active, and it's things being in their proper place, right? Because the act of the
which
light
requires
here,
work.
Well, it requires work, and it requires the interaction of the material, the earth, and the spiritual, the heavens, the interaction of the two. The light, remember, now is the interaction of these two things together, right? It's the bringing these two things together. That's what happens when God brings his light to the universe. His order to the world is bringing that spiritual meaning to the earthly matter. It's joining these two together. right?
Hmm.
Order of the earthly, the matter based thing, is the spiritual ideal being brought to bear on that earthly. That
Hmm.
is the process of ordering,
Hmm.
and that is what the bringing of the light, God bringing his order to the universe is. And
Hmm.
so that is the thing that is good. The earth on its own is not good. The spiritual on its own is not good. And by that, maybe we don't mean bad. We just mean not good. But the joining of the two together, the letting there be light, the bringing these two elements together, the light emanates from the heavens and shines upon the earth. It's the place in where the two interact and come together. That is what is good.
Yeah.
So, um, and as we've said, God, mentioning the light is good implies that all that is prior to or outside of the light is then not good, and we can, whether you want to call that bad or not yet good, or how we'd like to describe that, I
I think
guess.
not good is far better
Yeah,
because
I think
bad is
probably.
active.
Right. No, I
Bad
get that.
implies a yeah. Not good is far different. Yeah.
Right. I agree. I would say I think that's probably the best way to describe it. Is
I mean, it's not
not
good.
good.
Yeah.
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 Neutral would be
We're
even
we're getting a
preferred to
little
bad, I think.
we're getting a little Orwell newspeak going on there, but
Yeah. Right.
but yeah,
Right.
I do think it's probably the better way to at least think of it conceptually.
Yeah.
Uh Now I think there's,
Well,
go ahead.
can I
Yeah.
interject one
Yeah, because
thing
we're
then?
gonna transition to the next phrase here.
Okay, excellent. Because I think the it's funny because my immediate perspective is always emulation
Mm,
of what does this suggest is worthy of emulation with these
mhm,
things.
mhm.
So the idea of you even mentioned it that when we create, we do that like a painter might put the first brush stroke on a canvas and then step back
Mhm.
and continue with
Survey
their
the work,
work.
yeah.
And when they continue with their work, they don't think then after that. They do the
No.
thing, they do it, they do it,
Yep.
they do it, they do it. But that first stroke is oftentimes a step back and a
A
look and
pause,
then a
yeah.
continuation and something like that. It's a very natural instinct. And so the emulation here is that's almost how we create too, which I think is interesting just in and of
Mhm.
itself. And then also the implication that to if this is God's first step of ordering things, then to order things is good, is implied.
To
Then
order
to
things is good. We'll see though.
it not unreservedly
To
good,
to
but
order
it is
things
good.
according to God's order is good. Yeah, according to that which properly aligns the spiritual and the earthly. That is good.
Yes.
And we'll
Yes.
get we'll get into more of that, especially after Adam and Eve. As we get to Cain and Abel, we'll look at that more, and Cain versus Adam and all of this. We'll get to that part of it more clearly, because I don't want to just say to order is good, because there are many ways in which one can order. So I want to make sure we're saying that to order is
Well,
good as long as it's
let's
done
adjust
the
it
right
then.
way.
Yeah, let's adjust it then even then ordering is something to aspire to. And it should be done along the correct ways, but
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
preferred to not ordering.
Yes.
Uh,
Rightful ordering is what is preferred, and rightful
rightful
ordering.
ordering is good, but
Yes.
therefore, in order to achieve rightful ordering, you must aspire to ordering. And
Yeah.
so you
Yeah.
must
Maybe
begin
you
that
have to do both.
process as
Yes.
opposed to
Yeah.
not doing
Yes.
ordering.
Yes.
And so that's probably more accurate of just that you do have to initiate something and
Yes. Yes.
yeah,
For sure.
that's
Um,
interesting.
okay. And so now let's move on to the next part of this verse, which is interesting, because here we see God separates light from the darkness.
Yeah.
And to me, immediately, it becomes very curious, right? Because you then ask the question, why not destroy the darkness?
Hmm.
Right? There must be a reason. It's not a lack of capability, because if there was lack of capability, then God's not what we believe he is, right? So instead, his decision to not destroy the darkness, it reveals something about his nature, right? And it's interesting, especially too, with the idea of a God outside of time, because we see his decision to not destroy the darkness immediately is still, yet if he'll destroy the darkness eventually, right? Let's say, okay, he didn't destroy the darkness right here, but over time he will eventually destroy the darkness. If you're outside of time, he is doing it immediately in a way, right? Because if you're outside of time and experience all things at once, there's no destroying it before or after. It's just that the story now in between the darkness existing here and then being totally destroyed is different. And so it tells us that God is comfortable with sort of like a gradual process of the stamping out of darkness. And this goes a little bit to, well, first of all, as we'll see by the end of this, that eventually he's going to have a role for humanity to play in that process, in the process of stamping out the darkness. Only he can really do it, but we have a small part to play, basically. And this goes back to what I've talked about early on. We discussed a little bit the idea of creation as a way of God expressing himself, right? And demonstrating who he is to us, right? And so there's something about the idea of the darkness not being wiped out immediately that strikes me as interesting. And I look at this as being perhaps the first demonstration of God's mercy, because he's allowing the darkness to survive. And as we'll see as the story goes on, he will give the darkness an opportunity to choose the light. So he could stamp it out immediately, or he could force it into the light. But what God reveals about himself by choosing to do neither of those things, and as we'll see, giving darkness the opportunity to choose to come into light, is that it's an act of mercy. It's I would say it's compassionate too, to say, you're in the darkness, or the darkness exists. I'm not going to wipe you out. I'm not going to force you into the light, but I'm going to offer you, before I do that, which we know will eventually do, I'm going to offer you the opportunity to willingly come into the light. If that, so in a way, if you will, I sort of look at this verse 4 as almost laying out the entire message of the gospel in this one verse. We could see, right? God creates, God seeks to bring light into darkness, he separates them, but he will see that his light is separated from the darkness, right? That's what's very clear here. It's interesting. This light is definitely separated from the darkness. But he's by doing that, he's creating the opportunity for it to come into the light over time. And so even if he allows the darkness to persist, he's creating a room for that to be brought into the light, that he is keeping separate from it still. So it's interesting to me. And if we get into the question of sort of the fate of eternal souls and those kind of things, the idea of a lake of fire and those kind of things, I think is more metaphorical and not so material as people have sort of thought of it. And that the real damnation is eternal separation from God, eternal darkness, eternal separation from the light. Yet he still is allowing that thing to exist and persist. And I just find that endlessly fascinating.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah. That all of creation would not be good. Yeah. That's interesting. I begin to think that, sorry, I want to extend this just a little bit.
Yeah.
because I think not good is an interesting, and you can push back, but I think not good is a good definition of the darkness. And the idea of chaos and that creation comes out of that. So does potentially then genuinely evil come out of the darkness? But it comes out of the same darkness that light came out of. But what light comes from God, then I guess it imposes itself.
Right.
But what I'm getting at is that the idea of that, like
light cleanses the darkness.
Well, but if it's just not good and it's not necessarily evil,
sure,
that means it's just lacking in God, and potentially out of the darkness emerges evil.
Yes.
That doesn't mean the entirety of darkness is evil. It just
Correct.
lacks ordering.
Correct. Yes.
And potentially evil then is misordering of the darkness.
Yes. It
appears to me to be a third agent here. Like you can create the dynamic of just the good and evil, but then you have this potentially this third agent here. That's what seems to be emerging to me.
So I think that is a concept we will get into much more significantly when we get to the serpent and the tree and the man and the woman.
I think that's reasonable.
Because I think that's where we'll see that that idea sort of come to bear, and we'll get the fullness of what you're talking about here. But yes, I would say this is sort of the curious nature of the idea of Christian salvation. Is that the sin of sort of ignorance and the sin of just like the weakness of humanity is still enough to keep one out of being fully inside God's light. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's like it has to be this willful choice to adopt all of it, right? It has to be good. It has to be fully good, not just and there is this third, the evil. The evil absolutely is kept out, but so is the not good. It has to be fully good, and that the process of becoming fully good is completed and fully manifested through salvation, right? And through the glorification that comes from God. And yeah, so we'll get into it, I think, in much more detail, obviously, when we get to Adam and Eve. But yes, the implications of that, I think, are already here. And it's why when we get to Adam and Eve, I will make the assertion, and I think it sounds like you'll find that at least somewhat
compelling,
or at least plausible, that the sins of man and woman were not evil, that the only truly evil thing that happens there is the serpent. And so that's a bit of foreshadowing. We'll get into that when we get there, but it has to do with the nature of where God specifically used the term curse versus just describing consequences and all of that. So that at least we're seeing the possibility of that here, if we're really talking about this good and not good versus this kind of proactiveness that we think evil implies, I guess.
With this, it does definitely make it the innocent bystander is not genuinely innocent in that context. In that context, it's necessary for you to engage, to say that I'm just, it's like meeting people who say like, who say like, I don't, who feel like they're alleviated of the burden of political engagement by just saying like, I don't pay attention to politics. It's like, well,
right.
Well, that doesn't alleviate you entirely of the responsibility that you have. You're just choosing to not engage. You certainly may not be doing something evil. You might be avoiding that, but at the same time, you're certainly not doing something good.
This is the idea of not to act is to act.
Yes.
If we want to go back to
that's what the darkness seems to represent.
If we want to look back at our previous episode and our discussion of the darkness and the light and sleep, right? sleep being this idea of not engaging in the dark, right? Don't live in the dark. To me, there's a difference between to spread that symbol out somewhat. It's like there's a difference between choosing to live in the dark and choosing to not go to sleep versus just having happened to stay up too late, right?
Yeah.
It's those are two different things. I think we'll see that as time goes on.
But those things certainly don't get categorized as good. That's what's I
correct.
Yeah. The thing that keeps reoccurring to me is just that there's an insistence that engagement is necessary.
Yes.
That engagement is what you're called to. That's what's being called forth. At least let me say this, that engagement is what is being represented by God here. And so therefore is what seems to be required of you to emulate.
Yeah. As we'll see, as we get to the end of this order, to the end of Genesis 1 here, order requires engagement. The maintaining of order, the furthering of order, the furthering of God's order requires engagement.
I mean, this is why like one of the major sins of the Catholic Church, it was even laziness or slothfulness, and that's kind of like, well, what slothfulness? What sort of like puritanical view is that? But I mean, when you see this, it's like fundamental to who you are as a creature. Should be your engagement with this.
Yes, it
which
makes
is what's
sense
the opposite of the darkness.
That disengagement. Well, disengagement is wrong and not even actually a thing, right? If you
it's darkness.
If you tell yourself you're disengaged, you're just engaged on the wrong side of things.
Yeah.
It's like you can't even really truly be disengaged.
It's the untapped potential. It's the person who has immense ability but doesn't enact it at all. That's what feels to be represented there.
Yeah, or not even doesn't enact it, isn't seeking to enact it. It's like, because you could still fail, I guess, in a sense, to enact it because you're human, but like you must at least be seeking to enact it.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the misordering. When you enact it in in the wrong way, that's where you run into the potential for evil. Which is why fear could very easily keep you from acting.
We'll get to that with what God says to Adam after the tree. We'll get there.
It's funny how all these things lead us there.
Yes.
Almost as though it's intentional.
Almost. We are going to get to those things, but that's foreshadowed a bit for now. I don't know if you're stumbling on this video, months after we've recorded. Perhaps we're to that point, and you can get right Go there ahead. If you wanted to. Yeah. But all right. So join us next time. We'll talk Genesis 1:5. And in the meantime, like, subscribe, comment, review, email us at unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you then.
Excellent.